so we're not off to a good start. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kristine Lang. I'm an assistant professor and consumer horticulture specialist with South Dakota State. I'm based in Brookings, South Dakota, but work statewide. And I didn't know how many people I was going to have because I know the soil health discussion was probably very lucrative as well. So thank you for joining today. For context for me, how many people have a farm name or farm business that you're already selling some sort of a product through? Whether it's fruits, vegetables, meats, dairy, eggs, cut flowers. Okay. And the rest of you are thinking about getting into production or a supporter? All right. We're gonna, let's see. I don't know if this is gonna work. Okay. I'm going to start with an infomercial first. It was just a good way to explain who I am and what I do. So I work very closely with Dr. Rhoda Burrows, who is based West River and is our horticulture specialist and a professor at SDSU. And together, Rhoda and I are trying to conquer the world. No, we try to keep up with a really wonderful team of excellent graduate students that really support the Extension Local Food and Flowers Research and Outreach Program. So I just share this because not so much the stuff I'm talking about today, but like the things I do at South Dakota State and the outreach I've been able to accomplish and the research I'm able to do would not be possible if it were not for these four lovely humans: Alexis Barn, Connor Roon, Jocelyn Faussert, and Hannah Voy. And Jocelyn is our research assistant based at the Southeast Farm near Beersford, South Dakota. So if you want to learn more about them and what they do, feel free to check out our YouTube playlist about extension horticulture research. Also, this time of year, it's just fun to watch videos that show like green fields and blooming flowers and actual live plants versus mud or snert. So there's that. So yes, a large part of my role is kind of building this research and extension program, but consumer horticulture is in my title. So I also think about small scale production systems and how can the research and work that I'm doing be something that can be scaled up for commercial production, or possibly be scaled down or fit in a rural setting or fit in an urban setting. So a lot of the photos you're gonna see today of containers and raised beds, you're gonna be like, well, that's not on a farm. And full disclosure, I don't live on a farm right now. I wish I did. I actually have a second story balcony. So I just wanna show that like you can grow food and produce things even if you live on a second story apartment with a tiny balcony in Brookings, South Dakota. So, and I just want to say right now, anytime folks have questions, please don't hesitate to stop me. We're a small group, so we can have a nice, robust discussion about things. I'm happy to hear other ideas, what's worked well for you or not. And Rhoda, maybe give me like a 15-minute warning because I realize there's no clock. Thanks. All right, so why raised beds? You know, whether it's I'm supporting my community and I'm doing community gardening, or I'm starting a farm enterprise and I'm going to start small or I'm going to start fairly large. An advantage of raised beds right off the bat is you get to design your soil and control your situation. Some people, I've toured a site, West River, with Rhoda, that you know, their soil was super contaminated with heavy metals and other chemicals of concern. So they're growing everything in big raised kind of gallon, or you know, like the large stock tanks. So that's raised bed growing. Some people might have really, really compacted, crummy soil. Some people might have a concrete lot in an urban setting that, you know, there just isn't soil there to begin with. So that's a big advantage of raised beds. Another advantage is the soil warms faster. I know that maybe doesn't feel important right now when we're already getting nice and warm, but you do get faster warming soil. With that, the opposite can also be true. You do get harder freezes and freeze outs, which can be hard on soil life, depending on what your raised bed mix is filled with. You have opportunities for creative locations. Maybe there's a nook by the restaurant that you're starting, or there's, you know, a nook on your farm that this just makes more sense with what's going on in that space. Or maybe there's a gravel space and you want to expand and do some, specialty herb production, and I could fit it in this nook, but that nook is covered with gravel and I don't actually want to spend the time rebuilding all of that soil. I remember touring a farm in Iowa. They really liked growing specialty mint to add to their farmers market displays and add to their CSA boxes, but they didn't want mint taking over their entire farm, so their mint production was dedicated in raised beds. The only thing they did in raised beds, but it was to keep that mint where they wanted it. Accessibility, so thinking about whether it's yourself or people who farm with you, or some people have really creative farm models where maybe you want to create job opportunities for people who have mobility limitations or need more accessible spaces to grow produce. It's not uncommon to see raised beds at a nursing home facility, but I think we sometimes get bogged down like, oh, well, raised beds, I feel like sometimes people are like, oh, well, I'm too young to need a raised bed. I love my raised beds. They are awesome. I love saving my back. I already creak when I do things, so I'm gonna try to avoid more creakiness. My husband offered to build some raised beds for our friend Helen in Iowa, and she got very offended. I'm not old enough to need raised beds. And he was like, okay, I just thought they're just kind of nice. And I think for if you're a beginner in the room, or if you're trying to teach others or get people excited about growing their own food, I'm a big fan of all boats rise. So, having people grow their own produce and buy produce from you, both of those things can be true at the same time and awesome. So they're a manageable space for beginners. These are photos of quite small raised beds. I think these were 4 by 4 feet. So, not very large. And this was actually a project in Fargo, North Dakota at a shelter for people who were without housing for short periods of time, a men's shelter. And this was also providing opportunities for horticultural therapy and then use of that fresh produce in their meal program. So this was a kind of a full circle project. When I lived in North Dakota for a time, and I was actually just finishing up my Master Gardener volunteer internship, and then I moved to Iowa, but this was the project I got to work on, was doing a lot of raised beds. So that's the other place my pictures come from. The other side of that project, back to doing things for beginners, is the ability to have, teeny tiny raised beds. We pre-built these, so you have 4 square feet total for these little raised beds. And people in apartments, my co-volunteer built this little carrying unit. So we had, okay, we're gonna mix the soil as a group, you're gonna plant it, we're gonna give you a trellis for some peas or beans. And people just, came, because not everyone had a car, or we did this like in a central space in the middle of the apartments, and everyone took a raised bed home. And they could put it on their porch, or they could put it on their deck and get started and start growing plant material. Looking back, I wish we would have built them a little deeper. That was probably an oversight at the time. But this was also built, the square foot gardening, Mel Bartholomew, he was all the rage back in the 2010s. So this was really built following his model. But again, a great opportunity to engage more people. So even if you already have a farm, could you take something like this and do an on-farm, how to build a raised bed, or, add kind of like an agritourism or an activity or element to your farm? So, materials. Again, lots of different examples of things that I've seen or I've done. I rented a duplex in Ames, Iowa that had the world's crappiest, crummiest, most abused, hated soil. They had all of these pavers just kind of, randomly strewn about the rental property. You know how it sometimes goes with rentals. And I was like, I'm gonna grow all of the things, but the soil was garbage. So I just kind of started pilfering all of these bits and pieces and put it together and made my own little raised bed system. So again, kind of back to why we might do it. So, building things out of pavers, building things out of wood, out of reused materials, those are all things to consider. With wooden raised beds, which tends to be the most typical, Rot resistant is great, so woods that are naturally more rot resistant, such as cedar, black locust, some of the oaks. I'm gonna admit that my current raised beds are built out of untreated pine. We built them in 2022, so we've grown in them. This will be our third growing season in those. No, we built them in 21. So this will be our fourth growing season in them. They are starting to warp. It was untreated pine, but I was also new faculty and was just getting started, and also didn't expect to live in an apartment for 4 years. So, but they're still there. They're still hanging on. For anything food, which is probably what most of us are going to be growing in our raised beds in this audience, avoiding old treated lumber, especially I would not repurpose barn wood and make raised beds out of them without some sort of a lining or a barrier, because some of the older wood treatments are pretty nasty. Some of the newer wood treatments, like the heat or the pressure treated, not a big deal. But there are still some concerns about what wood should I use. Like, do I want to use green treat for my raised bed? The answer is I probably would advise against it. And Iowa State University did a deep dive on the different wood treatments and what you should look for if you do want to use treated wood. So they kind of have a gradient of, you should be really worried about this to maybe don't worry so much about this. So that article is called Toxicity Concerns About Raised Bed Construction Materials. And at the end of the day, if you do want to use treated lumber because you want it to last more than 4 years and not rot and fall off of your balcony so you don't have to move it, you can use things like water-based paints on the inside to seal, provide a protective barrier against the soil. Some people will put a plastic liner. If you're going to do a plastic liner, make sure the plastic liner has holes so you're actually building a raised bed and not a raised swimming pool, muddy plant pond thing. So just be aware of that. And again, blocks, bricks, stones, all of those things, I've seen some really clever repurposing. One that I want to caution against, and I did see on someone's rural property, and it kind of gave me a lot of anxiety. I would not advise against, or I would not advise using the giant pesticide totes, like the giant white plastic pesticide totes, sawed off. Even if you've triple rinsed that just makes me super nervous for residues of our plant's gonna grow in it and just food safety, human health implications. So I wouldn't do that for food. Yes. What? How do I feel about lick tubs? So that's what we use for cattle, right? Okay, sorry, I grew up on a poultry farm. I don't think I have a problem with lick tubs as long as they've been bleached and sanitized, but I'm going to defer to my food safety friend.
I think as long as you wash it and sanitize, you'll be fine.
So the consensus from Rhoda is lick tubs are going to be okay, or things that have been used around cattle or animal. If we bleach and sanitize, we're going to be all right. We'd want to put holes in the bottom of it for drainage. Yeah. So whether if we're using brand new stock tanks or sanitized stock tanks or lick tubs, we're going to want holes for drainage, because again, otherwise you're just having a muddy pond swimming pool thing, and you're going to be really disappointed. I've seen some nice kind of reused, repurposed. This was one that was at our local Foods Education Center. We have Larson doors in Brookings, so these were they were like out of spec metal door frames, and they just laminated them all together and filled it with soil and poked. I can't quite. I think it was a wood. It was some sort of bottom that had holes drilled into it. As you can imagine, that was really, really heavy. It did not blow away in the derecho. The high tunnel did. The raised bed was fine. Repurposing pallets. My husband made me this really cutesy one that hasn't completely rotted apart, but is very actively rotting, so I felt confident that that wasn't treated wood. And again, if you're using old painted wood, you know, if you're pulling, again, if you were gonna like repurpose barnwood or something, I'd be a little nervous about lead paint. So just something to consider. Again, reusing and repurposing as much as you can, but just asking a few questions about the human health implications. So, bed placement. It's really gonna depend on how much space do you have and how you're gonna water those beds. You know, if they're raised beds like this style, like it's on a soil surface, and those plants, albeit maybe compacted soil, those plants can still root into the soil. Because in a case like this, we were just raising the beds to kind of improve accessibility, help with weed management. We weren't worried about like anything nasty in the soil. If you're worried about soil contamination, you're gonna want a solid bottom or some sort of a liner. You're gonna want a deeper root zone. In this case, again, this area had kind of been just a common use space where people walked a lot, so it was pretty compact. But we expect or hope, you know, especially if you were managing for soil health over several seasons, that earthworms might start coming up and you might start getting a natural mixing of the soil. So in a case like this, eventually those plants will hopefully root down and be able to grab water from the natural soil profile. Water becomes really important, and potentially daily watering becomes really important if these had a plastic lining on the bottom and they were really, really shallow. So how are you gonna water? Do you have a garden hose? Are you doing rain catchment and just kind of a low volume pump? And are we gonna get enough rain that you can catch it? Are you filling watering cans in your sink and telling yourself, next year, I'm not gonna do it this way? And 3 years later, you're still filling watering cans in your sink and schlepping them out to water your raised beds. This might be the year. Apparently, there's an attachment you can get for your kitchen sink that turns it into a hose attachment. And I might get a nice clean gardening hose, and my neighbors are gonna think I've really lost it, and the apartment managers are really gonna wonder, but I might start hooking a garden hose to my kitchen sink. My husband's getting a little sick of my water schlepping. So how are you gonna water your beds? What do you plan to grow? Especially in an urban setting, you have to think about the buildings around you, what shadows are being cast, what time of day. That becomes really important in an urban setting. So the light considerations. If you're gonna put trellises up, I would not put those on the south side of my raised bed, because then you're gonna shade out all of your other plant material. What kind of weed pressure are you dealing with? And we'll talk a little bit more about weed management in a moment. And also, if that's the low area on the property and it's usually ponding water, you also don't want your raised beds to be sitting in ponding water necessarily. So maybe you're raising them because you're like, you know what, this is the only place I can grow food on my farm or on my property. And I'm gonna physically raise the beds and we're just gonna let the water soak in around it, but at least the plants are gonna be out of it. I mean, it's kind of like the concept of pulling raised plastic mulch beds on your farm. It's to get it out of the wet, which seems to not be that big of an issue for my part of South Dakota. For some of my friends up there in the northeast part of the state, you're maybe sitting in a little bit more water and have that as a concern. So, what to fill raised beds with. And you can see an example of our community project where people were doing the soil mixing together. I would say this is a little out of date, and or just take it with a grain of salt, because there's lots of ways to fill raised beds. If you are doing a solid bottom raised bed that is not like sitting in a soil profile where you're gonna have some natural movement of earthworms and mixing, I would discourage you from just filling it with black dirt from your local garden center or field soil or anything like that. It is gonna get pretty heavy and compact, so we're kind of worried about that compaction. You know, we want oxygen, we want space for roots to grow, and sometimes just straight field soil can be really heavy and really set. Also, if you are going out to your corn or soybean field and grabbing black dirt to mix into your raised beds or just add into any of your soil, do consider what was sprayed on that in prior seasons. I had colleagues who told me in Rhoda, like, okay, you can put your tomato research project here on campus. and that had been a cornfield, and they had sprayed atrazine on it, and there's like a 2-year period at least that we want to wait before we put tomatoes in that field or any other veggie crop. So just being aware of some, what herbicides have been sprayed on field soil if you are going to grab some of that and mix it in. And again, field soil can be great for being a component of your mix, but know where it came from or what the field history was, just so you don't end up with a lot of dead plants. Again, the Square Foot Gardening Foundation. Has anyone heard of Mel Bartholomew? He wrote the Square Foot Gardening book. It was a very nice book. And I think he really broke down the process of how to do some of these things. So his thing was 1 part compost, 1 part peat moss, 1 part coarse vermiculite. So compost is where you had that soil health benefit and that introduction of some actual biological activity. Vermiculite, to buy a large quantity of vermiculite, because that's the shiny stuff, that's expanded mica, it's very shiny and kind of squishy. So that helps with your water holding capacity, and you can get different grades, and if you get kind of a medium or a large grade, it'll add some more air spaces as well. But to go and buy a bunch of vermiculite from a garden center or wholesale it from a place like Tessman Company or somewhere where you might get a large volume of potting mix, vermiculite's kind of expensive. So that's kind of my one beef with that one. I'm going to pick on Mel for a minute. NDSU, they've got it seems like a very Dakotan recipe. Like, we're going to get field soil, and then we're going to add peat moss or compost to loosen it. So the goal of that is to really loosen that soil. Honestly, that's kind of the method I grew up doing. Is pretty sure my dad did we terraced a hillside and we called it raised beds. I'll have a photo of it in a little bit. But really what we did is we just terraced a hillside. So we held back earth that was already there. But every year we would mix in 1 to 2 bales of peat moss to just kind of keep loosening and improving that soil. And Iowa State University, 1 part topsoil to 1 part peat moss or compost, and then 1 part sand. And sand can be added to things, that's usually for aeration. If you have a really clay soil and you add sand, you're probably just gonna make bricks or concrete, so I would not advise doing that. I know people are from different parts of the state, so your soil and farming situation might look a little different. My situation was to schlep a lot of bags from the local farm store up the stairs through my apartment, mix it in the raised beds, and I bought kind of a topsoil or a soil mix that was some combination of topsoil, peat, and sand, and then 1 part compost. I wasn't super happy with it, so I tend to be adding peat moss back into that on an annual basis. I also am now trying to just compost within my raised beds in the off season. And this last year, I started vermicomposting in my raised beds while I was growing things. So did I buy a bag of red wigglers off of Amazon? And did my husband think I was a lunatic? The answer is yes to both of those questions. Did I follow the directions where you kind of just gently scatter the worms on top of your soil and cover them with wet newspaper, and then you check like 15 minutes later and they're gone because they're in the soil somewhere? It was amazing. So this is not very food safe, and this was for my own system, like in my cut flower bed. But as I was growing cut flowers in my raised bed, I would kind of just put my banana peels and food scraps out there and kind of let it vermicompost with my cut flowers in my raised bed. I also realized that that's kind of smelly when you're sitting on your deck, so there's maybe some things to think through with if I'm going to try to actively compost and enjoy flowers and sit out there and drink an adult beverage all at the same time. So there's this new trend with raised beds that I think Rhoda and I have both observed, where people are really excited about compost, and we are probably using too much of a good thing, because some people are filling their beds with just compost. And 2 weeks ago-ish, we had Natalie Hoydal from the University of Minnesota, who's an extension educator there and has spent some time thinking about compost and high tunnels and soils in general. And she gave a talk for us on soil health. So look up South Dakota Virtual Vegetable Short Course if you want to see that talk. It's on YouTube. But some of the things they've observed is we're typically putting way too much phosphorus into our raised beds or our soil, regardless of how we're using compost. And when compost dries out, it is actually really hydrophobic. And I saw this in action with a family member of mine in eastern Iowa. They did a really heavy compost application in their soil, and it was drying. It was so dry. I think also it was the learning curve of how much you actually have to water, because a lot of times, I don't know, growing up, I would like help water the plants and I'd be like, okay, I did it, the soil is wet. And then my dad would grab his pliers and take the handle of it and be like, you watered like this much. He's like, that be better. So it's also, you know, that learning curve of how much actual water you need to apply to saturate a soil profile. But if we're using too much compost, sometimes those beds are getting really, really dry, or the rain is just shutting off. So that's a few things to think about with compost. The other thing, courtesy of Dr. Burrows, and if you have anything you'd like to say about this, Rhoda, if you're using any sort of poultry, cattle, sheep, horse, I know we've got lots of great nutrient producers in this state that do the work for us, but if you're going to use manure from a food safety perspective, we would like to see you wait at least 120 days between when that animal product, that animal poop product, has been put on your garden or on your farm soil until you're harvesting a crop. And those rules, 120 comes from the organic standards and are kind of generally used for FSMA as well, right, Rhoda?
Yeah, just a slight correction. 120 days from when it came out the end of the animal to when you harvest it.
To when you harvest it. So 120 days from leaves the animal to I'm going to harvest this lettuce crop. The official advisement is 90 days for something like tomatoes, where the edible portion's not touching the soil. But Rhoda and I would like you to be more safe than not safe, so we tend to stick with 120. Yes?
I have a question. Since not all animal manure is created equal, what about these people that throw feedlot, disgusting manure on their crops, like filled with antibiotics and GMO corn residue and all that kind of stuff? What's the deal with that?
So the question is, just for the recording, different considerations for farm systems, like maybe an organic crop farm versus a conventional, or an organic livestock farm versus a conventional livestock farm, and differences in manure. And Rhoda, I might let you weigh in on that first, if you don't mind.
There aren't any official rules other than, the aging.
So no official rules other than you need to age it.
But what about the residue? What about the genetically modified, what about the glyphosate coming through because it definitely comes through the manure.
And I can talk about herbicide from a sheep standpoint. I don't know offhand that I have any research at my brain fingertips about this is what we know about what's passing through the animal from like a GMO versus an organic or non-GMO corn kernel on your crop. Some people definitely think about it. Again, I think people have their own ethics around it. Do you have any scientific thing I can pull from the air here, Rhoda?
The longer something like that is composted, the more of that is broken down by good microbes.
Yeah.
So, if you're kind of in doubt about it, I would put it through good composting.
Yeah. So more, and I do have something that touches on that, I think, on my next slide. So, time, heat, sunlight, microbial activity are going to break down certain things. How fast it breaks down this antibiotic from an animal gut or this corn kernel from an animal gut, I don't have the science at my fingertips on that, but it's an interesting question.
Good project.
Yes.
There are some herbicides that will go through the animal intact. Glyphosate is one, but some of the others that are used on lawns.
Yeah. And that, I wanted to touch on that, but I'll see what you have.
and also the decomposition.
Yeah, you queued me up perfectly.
Different input. So if you Google like, herbicides and compost PDF,
Yeah.
some of those will probably pop up.
Yep. Yeah, so for herbicides and compost, perfect segue, thank you, sir. There definitely is documentation of timelines on that. And again, the extension-y answer, and this does a deeper dive on it, but it depends on so many factors, and it depends on the chemical when it comes to herbicides. And again, there might already be some cool research out there related to corn and antibiotics. I just don't have it here. But yes, some manure sources, depending on, what kind of pasture an animal has fed on. If, there was a lot of broadleaf weed killer used and a lot of that went through the animal gut, that can sometimes create issues. If you're using a municipal compost source, one of our big culprits is we spray a lot of broadleaf herbicides on our lawns in an urban setting, and typically those grass clippings are going back into the municipal source. So don't be afraid to ask your local, if they're like, we're giving away compost, or it's $5 a truckload or whatever, don't be afraid to ask your local city if they do test their compost. And also, for herbicides, and don't be afraid to ask, do you happen to have on file a nutrient analysis for this compost so that you could actually know your amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium that you're applying to your soil? Some cities might be like, no, we've never done that before, but maybe if a few of you ask, they'll do it. And some cities do, and some cities share those results very publicly. So that's something to think about. When in doubt, when it comes to herbicides and compost or manure or your soil, any of the things, yes, exactly like our audience member said, there are publications that talk about how to deal with it, and there's really easy ways to test for it too. Take a couple of pots, plant something really quick growing like a pea or a bean, and also that seed's really cheap, and put it in that soil. And if you have like a bagged soil mix or something, that can be a control, and just watch the health of the plant. If you start to see a lot of really curly, weird, stunted growth, that's a great sign that there's some sort of growth affecting herbicide in that soil or in that compost or in that manure. That's probably going to create a lot of issues for sensitive crops like potatoes and tomatoes. I've seen examples of this where someone got, composted animal manure, or basically animal-based compost from a friend, filled their raised beds, and had really funky potatoes. And in that case, Rhoda and I are going to tell you, you really should not be eating that, because we don't know what that chemical is and what plant tissues it's stored in, because we don't know what it is. You could certainly submit a private test to a lab and find out, but our advisement is please don't eat that.
So who does testing for herbicides in South Dakota? Is it SDSU?
SDSU, we do not publicly test soil, water, or plant samples for herbicides. We have a nice list on our website of the private soil labs, and some of them do tissue testing as well, and some of them will do residue testing for herbicides. It gets really complex and expensive.
One of the issues is it really helps narrow it down to what they're testing for. Sure. If you just know it's funky looking, it could be a virus, it could be a pesticide, and then you have to know the class of herbicide, or you're going to have to pay for several tests.
Yeah.
And probably $200.
Yeah, so if you're flying blind on, I have no idea what happened or what this is, I mean, you'll be probably several $100 into chemical testing. So it's better to just give it the time for other things to take action and let it break down. So just a word of, not to be all like doomy gloomy, because raised beds are fun to talk about, but just, a little bit of foresight on the front end, so you're not trucking in a bunch of soil or going through the work of filling tons and tons of raised beds and then realizing there's a problem. So be proactive. All right, also fill them up. my friend Helen, so she was doing this. She was gesturing like, look at this beautiful raised bed. So she didn't want this style of raised bed, but she was okay with in-ground raised beds. That did not offend her. But she was like, look at the raised bed, and we've gotten it filled. Or she like texted that she was done, and I was like, oh, that looks great. When are you gonna fill it? And she's like, we did fill it. And I was like, oh, okay. And I'll do the same gesture here. My sister is a social worker in the Fargo-Moorhead area, and she did a small food project. She does not have a green thumb. She would not mind me telling you that. Also, beautiful raised beds, clearly built from some sort of a kit, I think. But she was also really proud of her raised beds, and I'm like, look at this nice tall one that we could grow deep-rooted crops in, like tomatoes, or maybe you could put a squash plant in there. But it's currently not full enough to be useful for that. So I too gave her a hard time for not filling them up. And then I filled my own teeny tiny little raised bed and put a plant in it and watered it and watched the soil settle, and I felt really stupid. So if you're building the raised bed, and I'll have a slide talking about root zone in a minute, but fill them to the top so that you can take advantage of the full profile for roots to grow into, for plants to anchor themselves. Again, different plants have different rooting depths. And also you have that much more soil to hang on to water, so maybe you don't have to water these things every single day or run a drip irrigation system every single day. So you took the time to build it, secure it, construct it, fill it up, and some people will ask with like the plastic stock tanks or the lick tubs, like, oh, I'm just gonna fill the bottom with plastic bottles or styrofoam or da-da-da-da. If you do things like rocks or plastic bottles, we have this weird thing, and I'm not a physicist, but it's kind of that old adage of, I'm gonna put rocks in the bottom of my houseplant pots or the bottom of my planters because that'll improve the drainage. And it actually does the opposite of that. When you put rocks in the bottom of a pot, all it does is actually raises the water table. So there's a zone where the water is going to pool and collect. And again, I'm not a water scientist or a physicist, but I've seen some cool graphics of this. But when you have a full container full of soil, the point of drainage is at the bottom of that pot where the holes are. So that's the area where there's a little bit more water and it's touching the roots. When you fill it with rocks, that pushes up, so then the roots are sitting in wet soil, that much more wet soil. So just know that adding rocks to the bottom of your pot does not improve drainage and actually causes more damage. And so I sometimes worry with the water bottles and the styrofoam or I don't know, like, don't just put trash in your raised beds. That just seems weird to me. If you're really worried about it, and if it's something that's, as deep as this table, again, if you fill this entire thing with soil, you're not going to have to water that every day because you've got this giant sponge of soil that's hanging on to water, and those plants are going to root down deeper. So even if the top couple of inches is dry, if you're not trying to germinate your carrots or get your little lettuce transplants to take hold, you're going to be fine. So let the soil do the work for you. But if you're like, no, I really don't want to pay for that much potting mix, consider something like false floors instead, and make sure you've got drain holes in it. So just something to think about, because I know if you're going to have to buy all the peat moss and buy bagged soil or pay someone to truck field soil to you, I know those things add up, and when you do the math on how many cubic feet you need, it's like, oh, I need to haul a lot of bags of soil up the stairs of my apartment. So annual maintenance, this can look different for everybody. I tend to just kind of stir my soil up a little bit and mix in some fresh peat moss, maybe top dress with compost. Currently, I'm not technically gardening in my raised beds organically, so I use a slow release coated fertilizer and stir in. There's a recommendation of like so many tablespoons per square foot of soil, and I'll just like stir that in into my soil. But you can see I leave some of the root mass and plant material. I'm trying to get a little more no-tilly with my raised beds now that I feel like I've got the soil where I want it. But I've spent the last few years amending it just to get kind of more soil life and kind of get more organic matter mixed into my soil, because I think there was more mineral soil and sand in that original bagged mix than I would have liked. But this is not something where you need to like take all of the soil out of your raised beds and refill it every year. There's ways to just build and improve that soil instead. So thinking about weed control, how many people have seen field bindweed climb around everything? Maybe if you stood still too long when you took a break weeding, it grabbed hold of you. I think that's the I know the bindweed in South Dakota is scrappy, but the bindweed in Iowa was next level scrappy. I think if you did sit still too long, it would get you. So remember my friend Helen and her raised beds? Even the deep ones, when we filled them, I mean, we had some of those that were 3 feet deep. Bindweed did not care that it was shaded out. It was like, I'm coming all the way through, hello. So in that situation, we should have stapled some weed fabric to the bottom of her raised beds to keep the bindweed from getting up and in. So, you know, something like a black woven landscape fabric to line a bed and, you know, maybe stapled really nice and tight. Now the bindweed probably would have still found the 3 inches that wasn't stapled and snuck through there, but I would have kept half of it at bay. But do think about your weed situation before you just throw down a raised bed. Thinking about walk pathways, this was at our local Foods Education Center. They did raised beds. I don't really know if they had a certain reason why they chose to do that. This high tunnel blew away in the derecho, and the raised beds are no longer there. So, okay, they had a drainage problem. That's right. Our local Foods Education Center on campus in Brookings, I think if I understood right, they inherited all of the soil that was like dug out to make the football stadium. They just kind of like threw it down on this lot in Brookings and smoothed it out and said, okay, you can put your student farm there. Have that soil. So it does drain poorly. So they were trying to get some height and not have plants sitting wet. But again, so landscape fabric, mulched paths, you know, just for getting something started. This isn't a raised bed, but, you know, straw mulch. I don't currently mulch my raised beds. So again, from a weed management standpoint, how have weeds been managed on that field if you're grabbing a lot of field soil? Or has your husband decided he loves feeding birds in the winter and he hangs the bird seed feeder over your raised beds? And then you spend the next summer picking all sorts of fun little grasses out of your garden, and you go, yeah, we're not doing that again this winter. So thinking about rooting depth, I realize this is super small, but I know this recording will be online. Or if you want to look this up, this is by Lott and Hammond from 2013. And it's the water-wise vegetable and fruit production chart, and it was adapted from the NRCS irrigation guide. So thank you, NRCS. And some key take-homes are, depending on what you want to grow in raised beds, you can probably get away with deeper or shallow. So if you're going to do some of our little quick-turn root crops like a radish, if you're just going to do little green onions, I mean, we know that onions aren't going very deep. You can get away with 6 inches of soil. That's their effective rooting depth. So an 8-inch raised bed would be great. A lot of crops tend to be in that 18-inch range. So when in doubt, I would build a raised bed that's 18 inches deep. Mine are 8 and 12. And I spend a decent amount of time watering. I also have a south-facing balcony. You maybe can or cannot tell that it's sitting on concrete, so it gets pretty hot, and those plants are they're transpiring more, especially when it's hot and windy on a south-facing balcony. If you're gonna do things like melons, or if you've got a wild hair and wanna do sweet corn in a raised bed, I tried that this summer. It was kind of fun. Having a deeper soil profile would be better. I was able to pull it off in a 1 foot deep raised bed, but the raised bed in the corner in this photo, the one thing to consider is the weight of the raised bed, and you might notice that the legs on mine are a little flimsy. That is one thing that did not work out well with the untreated pine. The legs on one got a little flimsy, so now this raised bed is no longer a table style, it's we're gonna sit on the deck style. So it made it easier to grow the sweet corn. So something to think about. Again, we've talked here and there about water management, but making sure that you're really saturating that soil. Thinking about if you're gonna do tabletop style raised beds or raised beds in general, is your soil flat? Is your deck flat? Is there a lean to it? Are you trying to grow carrots and you're watering the carrots in your raised bed and your deck kind of does this and you're washing all of your carrots to the outside of your raised bed and probably washed half the seed away? That's what this photo illustrates. So just even little things like that. Again, especially in an urban setting, if you're doing some nice tabletops, check that things are actually level so that you're not washing soil and plant material out of there. And thinking about when do plants need more water. So in general, with vegetables at least, whenever the thing that we probably want to harvest, whenever that activity is happening, is when we really should be paying attention to watering. So like our fruiting crops, from flowering through fruit set, water management is really important. As fruiting crops like a tomato or a pepper are setting those flowers and forming that fruit, water is really important. As we get closer to harvest, we don't want to suddenly drown our tomatoes in water right before we harvest them, because those cells expand really quickly and they tend to crack and you get cracked tomatoes. So water management becomes really important in both directions. A lot of our leafy green crops, as they get to size and we're getting closer to harvest, you have more surface area again for that water to be going up through the roots and those plants to be transpiring and water to be leaving those plants. So those tend to be periods where plants need more water. But another thing to think about is that front end period where we're trying to germinate those carrots and we need to keep that soil moist. Or if we're doing a lot of transplants, and most of our, whether we've gotten things out of 6-plaques or 72 cell trays, your root ball's probably that big. And so when that soil profile, that top 1.5 to 2 inches dries out, those transplants have nothing else to draw on until they're rooted deeper into the soil. So, those initial planting periods, managing water, really important. Once things are rooted in, you can kind of start to back off. We don't have to drown the things. But just things to be thinking about for timing of watering. And again, whether this is on your farm, in ground, or in raised beds. There have been many times where I have traveled for work or traveled for a long weekend in the summer to go see family and come back and my plants look pretty dry and pretty mad at life in my raised beds. And again, maybe not so much for this audience, but if you're trying to integrate any flowers and you want some lower maintenance drought tolerant flowers, think about things that have really hairy leaves, because that tends to slow down water loss from those plants. Things like zinnias, geraniums, salvia that have that furry leaf, or things that have succulent leaves. Just like cacti, they're kind of storing extra water in their cells, so they don't need as much water anyways. So things like moss roses and begonias. That teeny tiny raised bed at the top of my little raised bed tower, I now put moss roses up there and they do beautifully. They're so happy, they're warm and they're dry and they have like this much soil to grow in and they're okay with that. So thinking about plant spacing, unlike traditional farming where maybe we need to, get the tractor through and we need to be able to use cultivate the rows, or we want to be able to walk a wheel hoe or just be able to walk and pull weeds with raised beds. I meant to say this earlier, but one thing you want to think about with the width of raised beds is, can I reach in comfortably from both sides? And if you're gardening with a lot of children, for example, whether, just your own or for some sort of programming, remember they have littler arms and aren't going to be able to reach in as far. So think about designing those raised beds so you can reach in comfortably from each side, and then plant densely. There's some really great guides on how to do this. NDSU has a great example of, this is just based on plant growth habit, the number of things that you can put in a square foot. And when we were working with the men's shelter, we gridded it out so people could see where to plant and how much of different things to plant in each square foot. What? Okay, perfect, thank you. And again, another example of just thinking about planting distances between plants, and this one was from K-State. The background of this was one of my friend Helen's new raised beds, and we clearly sowed very densely all sorts of spinach and beets and carrots, and yeah, we had lots of greens that we could harvest off of that. Another thing about raised beds that I love is when you have your own loose, wonderful soil mix, you can grow some amazing root crops in raised beds. I tried to grow carrots. So this was in Ames, Iowa, and then, remember the compacted, crappy soil. Some of it I fixed, some of it I didn't. Yeah, we had, beautiful carrots and beets and all sorts of great stuff from these raised beds. And where I tried to grow the same crops in ground in our urban setting, we had like a carrot because the soil was so compact. So if you're wanting to do root crops, whether it's for yourself or just do a really nice job of them for market sales, raised beds, you can do an awesome job with them. So, plants for small spaces. There are a lot of things that will work well. Big, giant heirloom tomatoes are probably not one of them. Sweet corn in general, also not one of them. Some plants have smaller stature and are better suited to being used in these systems. I've found a couple of really nice resources, so I tend to cite them so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So UW-Madison has vegetable varieties for containers, and it's a really nice list. You'll notice that their list of carrots tends to be carrots that are shorter, like 6 to 8 inches long, kind of makes sense. So even without looking at those lists, maybe looking at seed packets and thinking about plant habits and looking for things that are more compact. All American Selections is a national trial garden program. McCrory Gardens in Brookings is one of their trial sites. I'm one of their evaluators. We actually don't evaluate vegetables, we just evaluate flowers, but they have vegetable trials across the US, and they have a specific category where they just grow vegetables in containers and rate their suitability. So these are 2 examples. The Hansel eggplant I grew in a container and I really liked it. It's also just a cute little eggplant, perfect for like 2 people instead of a huge family. And the Torenzo tomato is one that I learned about from our grant specialist at SDSU. Her name is Anne. She's a big fan of that one. And she too, I think, has grown it in a hanging basket. So the other trend that is kind of cool, and I've dabbled in, is dwarf tomatoes. So there are some companies now that are selling dwarf tomatoes. And I had a master gardener who shared a few seeds with me because she bought them from kind of a small scale like boutique seed company. Then the name totally escapes me, but they really did stay. They're determinate, so they're going to stay short in stature. They're not going to keep growing like a vine. And if this is my raised bed soil, they were only 2.5, maybe 3 feet tall, and they still produced a decent medium-sized slicing tomato. And being a scientist, I took notes like in a notebook on my harvest to try to track what was happening. And I need to find that notebook and actually put it in Excel and do a little graph and write an article about it. So currently it's sitting in a notebook somewhere in my office, I think. My husband was not super amused with my little tomato science project at home. But again, so dwarf tomatoes might be something else to look into. And just in general, I'll kind of rush these last few slides along, but think about ways to attract beneficial insects. If you're just doing leafy greens in your beds, you're not worried about pollination because unless you're growing your lettuce for seed, then maybe you are. But we're whether or not it's a crop that we need pollination, like our fruiting crops, like the cucurbits, our cucumbers, our melons, etc. But if it's something like our leafy greens, we might want to just attract some beneficial insects that are going to eat the aphids or parasitize the caterpillars that are attacking our vegetables. and let nature do some of that work for you. So thinking about integrating things like sweet alyssum or other low-cost, rapid-blooming annuals such as bachelor's button. Dill is actually a great one, so harvest the dill you need and then let the rest of it go to bloom. Coriander, buckwheat, zinnia, all great options where you're providing a pollen and a nectar source for insects. One of my favorite things is we had dill and carrots and some other things in the same plant family as carrots, and we had black swallowtail butterflies lay eggs and hatch and start feeding on all of our dill, and then we had some chrysalises form, and we had beautiful butterflies that really confused the cat, but were just really fun to have in our gardens. And SDSU has a really cool guide about natural enemies that are beneficial, and it's a photo guide, so they have great pictures and information about things like lacewings, parasitic wasps, hoverflies, etc. So I don't know that, Rhoda or I brought those with us, but if anyone's at an event sometime soon where Patrick Wagner or Adam Varenhorst or Amanda Bachman is there, hit them up. It's a really cool flip guide. And then, of course, companion planting. And we could do a whole discussion just on this. But I think what I'll say about companion planting is, again, Natalie Hoydal, she's just a rock star at the U of M. She's written a really nice science-based research article because there's some really cool things about companion planting that, you know, we've observed and seen have worked. And then there's some cool scientific studies that have tried to figure out, like, why is that working or what's going on? And there's been a lot of traditional knowledge passed down around companion planting as well. So University of Minnesota has a nice article that kind of looks at all of those components. And also just kind of a plug to think about ways to make gardening in general kid-friendly. This is my nephew Jack. He's gotten a lot taller since I took this photo, but he loves helping his mom garden in her raised beds. Plus, having the kids help like mix the soil and fill the raised beds is a great way for you not to have to do it, which is how my sister-in-law filled her raised beds. If you are doing things with kids and you have any concerns about should kids eat this flower or not eat that flower, I know this is from North Carolina, but it's the Plant Toolbox. And one of my favorite things is you can look up and they'll talk about, is this plant toxic to skin? Is it toxic if it's ingested? You know, will it kill you immediately? It kind of gives you some of those pieces of information. So I like that website. If you're worried about a cat who likes to garden, or a dog or a horse, I think this covers all of those things. Oh, this one maybe doesn't do horses. ASPCA does horses, and I'm sure there's other better horse resources. I'm sorry, I haven't grown up as a horse owner. But I will say Pet Poison Helpline you can type in, like, if there's some plants you're curious about, they have a plant list and what's toxic for cats or dogs, or, you know, what's problematic. I've started planting catnip to try to attract the cat there. And so I've just now turned the whole bottom bed into catnip because it turns out the coleus was kind of problematic. I didn't really want him munching on that. But what I've learned about my cat is anything that looks like a grass, he's going to be in that raised bed, which also goes back to food safety implications. So, and again, this is more the cutesy, like creative if you wanted it to be beautiful. So if you're doing agritourism and need some beauty on your farm. Vertical growing, again, that was terrible to keep watered. I never did that again. That's all moss roses now. Creative combinations of flowers and vegetables. So I snuck in some Swiss chard with some chenille plant and some bacopa for trailing. I worked in a garden center in another life, so I'm kind of big on the ornamental side of things too. Thinking about cool versus warm season, how can you maybe flip your raised beds? You know, grow some quick cut arugula, pull that out, put something else in. You can do the same thing with flowers. Okay, here's the picture of the holding back the earth. Those were railroad ties, which were filled with creosote, which was definitely leaching into our soil. Note that we never grew food in those. So if you're someone who wants to repurpose railroad ties, do as I say, not as I do. Do not grow food in railroad tie raised beds. And people will ask, if I grow strawberries in the stock tank, is that going to overwinter? Most of the time, probably yes. Some of the time, maybe not. It's going to depend on your volume of soil. My raised beds that are flat bottom and the cold air that soil's frozen solid. I've overwintered chives once. I think strawberries, maybe. Again, the stock tanks tend to be enough soil. Things like this where it's a raised bed built into the ground, that tends to be enough soil and thermal mass right there with the ground. Where we have these crazy warm-ups and thaws and things are coming out of dormancy, and then it's going to get really cold with no snow. You know, just like everything in the Dakotas, it depends on the winter. So with that, I will land on some resources. So again, SDSU Vegetables, How to Grow It series, Vegetable Gardening in South Dakota, authored by our lovely Rhoda Burrow. So those are things to consider. The NDSU, the Facts of Square Foot Gardening. U of M has some cool stuff on raised beds, and that companion planting article. I'll let everyone take their picture of that. And I've got 2 more resource slides with QR codes if anyone wants to keep their camera open. Okay. If you enjoy listening to me talk, or listening to me, or reading things I write, or listening to Rhoda talk, or reading things Rhoda writes, I do encourage you to subscribe to our Garden and Yard newsletter. We always have an events section, and we're going to try to have more on-farm field days, do some high tunnel builds this summer, do some more high tunnel education. You never know where you might find us across the state, maybe some more food safety trainings, and who knows what else we're going to dream up. So if you want to stay tuned to the events that we're doing in person or virtually across the state, please subscribe to our newsletter. And if you also just want to look back at what were they talking about last summer, you can see the full archive of our articles. And that is everything I have. Don't ever be afraid to reach out, follow up, ask me questions. Look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you. Are there any last burning questions? I think we're at time, but I'd entertain one. Okay, well, I'll hang out. Feel free to approach me on the sitting here.